Hi, my name is Sarah Letsky. I'm going to be talking about executive function skills and literacy. Just a little bit about me before we begin. I'm a faculty member of the Bay Path University Reading and Literacy Instruction Program. I teach the Language and Literacy Disorders course. I have been a speech language pathologist for all of my career, and thus I'm very interested in the oral and written connection. I've practiced in many settings as a speech language pathologist, from early intervention to hospital, clinical, and mostly school systems. I've also done a lot of supervision in my career, and one of my favorite things has been creating, co-creating, and facilitating courses for my peers in the school system, the other faculty members, as well as graduate students and undergraduate students. This is an advanced organizer of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to cover three basic questions. The first one is, what are executive functioning skills? The second one is, how are those skills related to literacy? And the third question is, what can we do to support executive function skills in relation to literacy? So as you can see under that first question, we'll be addressing three different dimensions or components of executive function skills. I'll give examples of each component. We'll talk a little bit about causation, and we'll talk about how experiences can either shape or hinder, can either help with the development or hinder the development of executive function. The second question is how executive function skills are related to literacy. I'll talk a little bit about the research, and then we'll discuss the relationships between the components of executive function and literacy. And then finally, in terms of supporting executive function skills, I'll spend a lot of time on that piece, that question. We'll talk about some of Sarah Ward's strategies. I'll give a summary of a framework from Bonnie Singer and Tony Bashir's article on verbal working memory. And then we'll talk about some other promising intervention ideas. So what are executive function skills? This is a great quote that comes from the Center on Developing Child at Harvard University, that having executive function in the brain is like having an air traffic control system at a busy airport to manage all the arrivals and departures of dozens of planes on multiple runways. And when you think about executive function, that is a great analogy, because we are having to focus and hold and work with information in mind and filter distractions and switch gears, just like you would if you were an air traffic controller. And our capacities to multitask, to display self-control, to follow multi-step directions, even when we get interrupted, and to stay focused on what we were doing, even though there are so many distractions, that's essential for intentional goal-directed behavior. And it's also essential for success in school as well as adulthood. So sort of a working definition of executive function skills would be brain-based skills that are used to control one's thoughts and behaviors to accomplish goals. And most experts agree that executive function is made up of three different components. And I'm going to just go over those very briefly here, but we'll get into more detail on the following slides. So the first one is working memory, and that's our ability to retain and work with information in our brains. The second one is inhibitory control, and that's our abilities to focus our attention and filter distractions and control impulses. And the third one is cognitive flexibility, and that refers to our ability to switch mental gears. Let's go into a little more detail about each one. So let's start with working memory, the ability to hold information in mind for a short period of time. When you think about that, you usually probably think about digit span. when in a psychological test, you give a span of digits and someone has to recall it by repeating it back. And that is one way to measure short-term verbal working memory. But as you'll see today, there's a lot more to it. So we're going to use that information that we're holding in mind to reach goals. So for example, to do a task. And a daily life example of that would be trying to remember a phone number that someone just told you when you don't have a pen or pencil to write it down. So you have to keep it in your mind until you have the ability to write it or call it. And then an example from literacy would be processing complex sentences. So this passage comes from a standardized test that was given to 7th graders, and it's about the Panama Canal. So think about what you would need to do in terms of verbal working memory to process this sentence. After researching the mosquitoes' habits, the team drained swamps, cleared vegetation, sprayed oil on standing water, released minnows to eat mosquito larvae, and bred spiders, ants, and lizards to feed on the adult insects. So not only do you have to keep in mind across sentences from the sentence or two before what the team here is referring to, but you also, when you get to the end of this sentence, have to remember all that information from the beginning in order to make meaning about the sentence. Now we're going to move on to the second component, inhibitory control. And that is when you stop automatic or impulsive responses. You ignore distracting, irrelevant information in order to reach a goal. So again, we're seeing that goal-directed or intentional behavior. You can master thoughts and impulses so as to resist temptations, distractions, and habits. And you pause and think before acting. So a daily life example of that would be trying not to eat cake when you're on a diet. You can see how that would take some inhibitory control, particularly if it's a really delicious looking cake and you're hungry. A literacy example would be suppressing or inhibiting responses to distractions while you're reading. This always makes me think about the classroom and what a busy place that is and how many distractions happen in a classroom all day long. And so trying to continue the task that you're on, particularly if it involves reading, you could see how that would pose some challenges for people who are struggling with inhibitory control. The third component of executive function skills is cognitive flexibility. And that's when you are flexible with your thoughts and actions, and you can think about something in multiple ways. You can switch gears during activities and adjust to changing demands, priorities, or perspectives. A daily life example of that would be trying out when your internet goes down, and instead of flipping out about it or just getting upset, you try out different methods of either getting the internet back or getting your task done without the internet. So that's showing cognitive flexibility. A literacy example would be understanding the many different perspectives that you see in books, characters, and also if you're writing from an opposing viewpoint. So understanding other perspectives. Okay. There were a few other thoughts about executive function skills that I just wanted to cover. Some of them are just sort of a summary of what we just talked about, but what do executive function skills help us to do? To remember the information we need to complete a task, to filter distractions, to resist inappropriate or non-productive impulses along the way to accomplishing that goal-directed behavior, to sustain attention during a particular activity. And then we use executive function skills to set a goal, to plan ways to meet those goals, to assess our progress along the way, and to make adjustments if necessary. And then manage frustrations so that we don't act on those frustrations as well. So let's think about the development of executive function skills. We are not born with them, but we're born with the potential to develop them from infancy to early adulthood. So a range of tests that we're measuring different forms of executive function skills indicates that they begin to develop shortly after birth, with ages 3 to 5 providing a window of opportunity for dramatic growth. So there's that rapid period right around preschool age where there's growth, rapid growth, and the potential to really help develop those executive function skills. And that growth, not as dramatic of a rate, but the growth of development of executive function skills continues throughout adolescent and into early adulthood. And then the proficiency declines later in life. So it is definitely shaped by our experiences. And some examples of those would be interacting with adults, creative play, games, and schoolwork. And language plays a really important role in executive function development. And that's also a big, that 3 to 5 year age range is also a very big explosion of language development. And so those two, there's a lot of interplay. Another piece that we can talk about is how experiences can hinder executive functions development. So children who experience adversity at an early age are more likely to have difficulties and challenges with executive functioning, suggesting that they are vulnerable to disruption early in the developmental process. So some examples of things that could disrupt the executive function skill development would be early abuse and neglect, early childhood stress, orphanage rearing, prematurity, and prenatal alcohol exposure. Also, I'm not going to get into the neurodevelopmental or neuroanatomy too much, but the research is showing that if you have a child who is showing reduced executive function skills, oftentimes it's a protracted development of the prefrontal cortex is what is to blame. So protracted development of prefrontal cortex in the brain is where you see the reduced executive functioning skills. We're going to move on to the second point, the second question, which is how are executive function skills related to literacy? And yes, they are. And there is quite a bit of research out there. A lot of it seems to be related to reading comprehension, but there is research, especially longitudinal studies such as this one, that show that executive function skills are predictive of later literacy. And the Serino et al. Study showed that executive function skills contributed to all reading outcomes. In other words, not just the reading comprehension, but all of the reading processes, including decoding, fluency, and comprehension. So children's executive function skills provide the link between early school achievement and social, emotional, and moral development. So let's keep talking about how executive function skills are related to literacy. Let's look at each component. So the first component is working memory. So how is that related to reading? Well, when you think about sounding out words, it's a string of phonemes, it's a string of sounds. By the time you get to the end of those sounds, you have to remember what was in the beginning in order to sound out and figure out what the word is that you were trying to say. So particularly with long, complex words, it really does make demands on your working memory to sound out words. And then even when you become fluent in reading, you still have to remember what you've read and update your understanding as you read. Another piece of the working memory when reading is that you have to hold on to multiple small chunks of written information. And then at the end of that sentence or at the end of that paragraph or at the end of that chapter, you have to glue all those concepts together into a meaningful whole in order to make meaning of what you read. So that definitely creates demands on your working memory. In terms of writing, you have to have a recall of the spelling and grammar rules. And also, as you're writing, you need to keep your topic in mind and remember what it is that your goal is for the writing. Now let's move to inhibitory control. In terms of reading, you have to ignore irrelevant information when you're trying to understand what you're reading. You also have to inhibit other meanings, for example, with multiple meaning words. You have to inhibit the other meanings. And then in terms of writing, during the planning stages, you want to inhibit the ideas that you've already covered to allow for new ideas. And then during the revision stages, you have to inhibit the original way something was written in favor of a more effective way. The third component, cognitive flexibility, is related to reading. When you're engaging in, coordinating, and switching between multiple mental processes during reading, for example, you have to interpret what words sound like and what words mean and make sense within that particular context of what you're reading. So for example, with multiple meaning words, which of the meanings fits best within that context? And being flexible in interpreting phrases as literal or figurative, depending on the context of the story. In terms of writing, you need to be flexible in thinking of alternative ways of saying something. So wording as you go along, what works, what doesn't work. You have to be able to switch back and forth and think of other ways to say things or to change the whole organization of something like an essay. So it's during creation as well as revision in writing. You also have to take on multiple perspectives in fiction writing or imagine both sides in a comparative essay. So we've now covered both of the questions about what are executive function skills, as well as how are they related to literacy. And I'm planning on spending the rest of the time in terms of giving strategies for supporting executive function skills. So the first person we're going to talk about is Sarah Ward. She is an expert on executive function. Her background is as a speech language pathologist, but she's the co-director of Cognitive Connections, which is a private practice. And she also writes, does research, and speaks all over as an expert on executive function. And her perspective is really interesting and very practical and functional for parents as well as teachers. So I am going to give you the reference for the link for a wonderful talk that she did, and I would encourage you to watch it. It's a link on YouTube, but I will sort of summarize some of the things that she said. So the first thing she talks about, she mostly covers working memory. So that's what we're going to cover here, is that first component of executive function, working memory. So Sarah Ward talks about how important working memory is, but also that there's an order, a very specific order of working memory. And it starts with nonverbal working memory. So that's sort of your thought bubble that you create, those mental images that we create in our minds. That's the nonverbal working memory. And then that piece drives the if-then or cause and effect thinking, which is the verbal working memory. And that if-then cause and effect thinking is self-talk. If I have to do that, then I do this, and that is verbal working memory. What Sarah Ward says is that without that nonverbal thought bubble, there is no if-then thinking. And that's where you see students who are very impulsive. You see impulsivity because if you're not thinking ahead and making a picture of in your mind of, if I do this, then this is going to happen, then you may just be impulsive and do behaviors without thinking of the consequences. So it's important to look at what the child's capacity is to create that mental imagery, because a child may have verbal working memory, but if they don't have that nonverbal piece then it's not going to be in the form of self-directed talk. So again, that's where you see that impulsivity, because there's not a cause and effect thought bubble ahead of time. I'm going to show you a picture that Sarah Ward shows of a little girl, isolated to a picture of her within a group setting. She's sitting in circle time at class, and the teacher is explaining what they need to do. It may be something like, go to your desk, and during writer's workshop, I want you to write about what you did this past weekend. And a child who has that nonverbal working memory is already, as the teacher is talking, forming images in this nonverbal working memory thought bubble. She's already thinking about what she did last weekend. Might have been a birthday party she went to, and she's picturing the piñata, and she's picturing the present opening. And she may also have a concept of how much time this is going to take her. And she may even have a picture in her mind of what that paragraph will look like, how long it will be, and what it might look like when it's done. So by the time she's sent to her desk to work on it, she's already got she's ready to go with her task, because she was doing that if-then thinking. If I need to write a paragraph about this past weekend, I think I could write about Lauren's birthday party and the piñata that was so fun to hit and the candy that came out. So she's got that cause and effect piece, and she's doing that self-talk piece where she will be able to picture it in her mind and project herself into it. And by the time she goes to sit down, she knows what her task is and she knows how to execute it. Whereas a child who doesn't have that nonverbal working memory and can't create that mental image, that child is just going to be drawing a blank when they sit down at their desk. They didn't do all these things ahead of time. They're going to need adult prompting to get through that entire task, even from the get-go, in terms of getting a pencil and getting the paper. So Sarah Ward talks about some strategies. This is one of them, and she talks about this in terms of situational intelligence, or what she calls SQ. And situational intelligence is at any moment in time, knowing what is going on in the situation. Stop and read the room is the acronym. And basically the space word stands for, what kind of space is it? What's going on there? What are the pathways that I need to use? How do you navigate the room? The time piece is getting on the timeline. What time of day is it? What's happening in this moment of time? What's the sequence of actions that are happening in this time? The objects piece is organization and objects. And so how is the space organized? The whole to the parts, for example, location of objects and the purpose of the objects that are being used there. I'll show you an example in a minute. And then the people is reading the person. What's the role of the people in the room? Look at face, body, appearance, mood, and then what's my role right now as a person in this group? So here is a picture that Sarah Ward shows of that STOP, situational intelligence. And you can see that there's zones throughout the library there. And Sarah Ward talks about if a student who has really good situational awareness comes into this group, maybe that student has been out for some kind of a special instruction and comes back into this group, they look around, they see the situation, they know that this is where things are in the library. They see that that is the librarian, that right now the time is an earth lesson, and they're learning about the globe. That's one of the objects there. And that the teacher's role is talking right now, but the student's job is to sit on the rug and to be listening and watching the student. A student who does not have good situational awareness, situational intelligence, is going to just burst into the room, start making comments about, I don't like sitting on that black spot on the rug, or maybe that student will go right to the globe and, I've been to this place before. They don't read the room and figure out what their role is, what's happening with the space, the time, the objects, and the people in the room. And Sarah Ward talks about how that just only gets more complicated and faster paced as you go up in the grades. So we need to teach that to students. Another strategy that Sarah Ward talks about is mimetic ideational informational processing. And if you just kind of look at the mime and the idea, it's basically miming an idea of something. So it's mental trial and error situation. I'm going to talk about this. She's saying that teachers really need to teach this. It's a critical skill for teachers to teach. So it's a combination of situational intelligence that we just went over, that STOP, reading the room, with nonverbal working memory that we just discussed as well. And what you do is you mime the idea of something in your head. You're making a mental movie of what's going to happen in the future. And so it's sort of like nonverbal working future memory, which is a mental pre-simulation of the future. And what it allows you to do is do some trial and error in your head without the risk of actually making a mistake. So the example that she gives, and I love this example because this really explains a lot. She talks about, okay, we do this every day. You're leaving work at 3:30. You think about, I think I need something for dinner. So I think I'll go over to the store. I'll pop into the store and get food for dinner. And you might even, in that pre-simulation of the future, you may even be making a mental movie of what specific groceries you're going to buy, because what do you need in order to make that final dinner, right? And you're picturing yourself going into the grocery store and getting all those things. Okay, and then after that, I think there's a TJ Maxx right next door. So I think I'm gonna go in there and I'm gonna see if they have anything new. Maybe just go through the store and just see if there's anything new that I might want to pick up for the house. Then I'm gonna get into my car. I'm gonna start driving down the highway and, oh, you know what? I'm gonna get stuck at that time of day, because by then it's going to be 4:30 and I'll be stuck in traffic. So what I just did is I pre-simulated the future. I had myself in it. I projected myself into it. And as I moved, I figured out I sort of had a feeling for how much time it would take me. And that allowed me to sort of feel how I would feel sitting on the highway in traffic at that time. And that allowed me to now think, oh, I don't want to do that. That doesn't feel good. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to redo that. Maybe I'll just pick up something quick at the grocery store. I'll skip TJ Maxx. I can always go there later. And then I'll just get into the car and go home. So that's sort of like the example that Sarah Ward gives. And basically that future thinking, she says, we need to teach that to our students, and it has to have 4 key elements. If we don't teach our students the 4 elements, they won't be able to be independent. They'll be prompt dependent. So the acronym she uses is to be a mind mime. So M-I-M-E, mime. Mime it is her acronym. And we'll go over each one of those letters. So the M is for make an image. So that's that future scene thinking where you stop and think what something will look like. The I is what do I look like within that? So you're projecting yourself into the future. If you're just picturing the grocery store, or if you're just picturing the TJ Maxx and not you going through it, then it's not planning. You have to put yourself into it in order for it to actually be planning. The next M is for moving. How am I moving to achieve this? And she calls this mental time travel. And she said, this is how you do time management, because as you move from place to place, with this mental imagery, this mental movie, you can feel how long it will take. It's yourself in time, basically. And then the future emotion is, how will I feel? So for example, how will I feel when I'm there? How did I feel when I was sitting in traffic? I didn't like that feeling, so that allowed for my mental trial and error where I could go back and change my plan. And you can talk through the experience so that you are efficient and successful. So one of the things that Sarah Ward talks about that is so key is that 90% of the time, task planning happens in a different space from where you execute the plan. 90% of the time, task planning happens in a different space from where you execute the plan. So if you think about a child at their locker, either in the middle of the day or the end of the day, let's do the end of the day as an example. That child needs to be a mind mime. You need that future thinking in order to plan and make sure you have all the right materials and materials. So for example, a student standing at the end of the day at their locker might be somebody who has good mind miming, is going to stand at the locker and say, I know I need to write a summary of what I read tonight. So let me picture myself doing that. Okay, I'm reading the book. All right, I need to bring the book home. And then I'm writing my summary in my log book, my log notebook. Okay, I need to bring my log notebook. Same thing with if you're going to be doing math and you need a calculator. If you're picturing yourself using that calculator, it's going to remind you to put that in your backpack and bring it home. It's similar to when you're in between classes and need to get things from your locker for the next class and potentially even the class after that. You have to have that ability to make a mental image and self-talk to get yourself through it and make sure that you have what you need. Because task planning most of the time happens in a separate space in a different place from where you're actually executing the task. So Sarah Ward talks about backward planning, and that is how we need to teach students to do the executive functioning that's necessary to get tasks done in school. And so what we need to know, oftentimes people go with the ready part first. What do you need to do to get ready before they do the actual, what does it look like when it's completed? And what Sarah Ward is saying is that you need to plan backwards. So we need to know the mental image of what the task looks like when it's finished, the done. I'm going to show you a picture, a couple example of these in my next few slides. But first, you need to teach, what does that project or task look like when it's done? Then what do I need to make it look like that? So what do I need to do to make it look like that? That's the do part. And then finally, what do I need? And that's the ready part. What objects do I need? So as you can see, that's backwards, and students need to pre-imagine and plan backwards so that they can execute forwards. And starting at that get ready step creates prompt dependent students, because we as teachers, we can facilitate independence more by teaching the backward planning. Otherwise, children are just following a checklist. So speaking of checklists, checklists are verbal working memory. Remember, we talked about that executive function starts with nonverbal working memory. So checklists in and of themselves create prompt dependence, and it's not enough to just give a checklist to a student with executive function challenges. And another really interesting piece is that the research is showing that you can tell when someone is actually mentally simulating performing activities because you'll see gesturing happen. You saw when I was telling the story about what I was going to do after work with going to the grocery store and checking out this, you saw me gesture. And that is because when you gesture, that means that's a sign that you're mentally projecting yourself into that future and making those mental images. And that by itself creates emotion. So we want to develop that nonverbal working memory in our students so that we'll see that they're gesturing through it. And that drives that self-talk in the form of stated intentions. And remember, that's what executive functioning is about, is accomplishing those intentions, that goal-directed behavior. We want to see that self-talk and gesturing. So Sarah Ward suggests taking a photo of a finished product and then ask the student to describe their plan to match that picture. When they describe their plan to match that picture, you should see gesturing if they're truly making a mental image. If they're walking you through the plan, what that does is that helps them to self-project into the future, see what it looks like, see how they feel about that, and it develops that whole mind-mime skill. So an example of a ready, do, done, I've got two here. This one, I took two literacy examples. So this one is a response to literature, or actually in this case, it's a prediction. So you start with the done, and notice how this is not a vertical checklist, this is horizontal. And it looks like the final get done behavior is sharing your ideas with the class. But in order to do that, this is what it's going to look like. In your thoughtful log, you're going to have a prediction and evidence, and then I think this is switched up and down, but a second prediction and evidence for that. Okay, so if this is what it looks like as a finished task, then what do we need to do to make it look like that? Well, what we need to do, it looks like we don't have to read. We just have to look at this cover of the book and then write what we predict it's going to be about and our evidence. And we have to do that twice. Okay, then if that's what I have to do, and this is what it looks like when it's done, what objects do I need to get ready to do that? And you can see there's a list for the get ready. Here's another example. This is vocabulary. And you see the finished product here of what it looks like when it's done. It's making 5 note cards using the link strategy. And then in order to do that so that it looks like that, here's your vocabulary words. And on the front of the cards, you're going to write the term and a reminding word. And then on the back of the card, a definition and a picture. And in order to do these things, what do I need? What objects? These are the objects I need. So those are some examples of the get ready, do, done strategy. When I taught a language-based class for a short period, I tried this strategy with my students for their book reports. And so we had a picture of our trifold project board with some pictures on it and the writing on it so they could see what the writing looked like with the separate paragraphs, etc. And we together did the ready, do, done by starting with the done, then doing the do, and then the get ready. And every one of my students rocked that project. They did so well because they had been part of the planning process and they were able to do the backward planning and picture what that final product was going to look like, and then also time getting it done accordingly so that they were all handed in at the right time at the due date. So I strongly believe that this works. That's it for the Sarah Ward strategies. This is another couple of quotes from Linda Hecker's blog post on supporting executive functioning skills. I just liked these quotes and wanted to share them. If we think about what students face when they tackle a textbook, we can see executive function at work, from planning where and when to read, to extracting meaning in a way that supports understanding, retaining, and applying information. In short, reading equals hard mental work. And the other one, for classroom teachers, appreciating the critical contribution of executive function to reading can help us structure reading assignments for success, building in scaffolds such as guided questions and reflection points, illustrating new concepts with vivid examples, making sure students understand the why as well as the what in order to enhance relevance. Now I'm going to move on to a wonderful article by Anthony Bashir and Bonnie Singer. The link is down here and it's in my references, but it's called Wait, What? Guiding Intervention Principles for Students with Verbal Working Memory Limitations. I highly recommend this article. It's been very helpful to me, and I always have my students read it, and they find that they get a lot out of it in terms of supporting that component of executive function skills that has to do with working memory. So what this article is about, and I'm going to give you a summary, is that executive function processes are what allow us to engage in goal-oriented behavior, and doing school requires us to act deliberately and with intention all day, every day. This is a quote from the article. Verbal working memory has been found to be particularly vulnerable in children with specific language impairment, resulting in pronounced difficulties with phonological memory and syntactic comprehension. So phonological memory is your recall of strings of sounds that you've heard or read. So obviously that plays in quite a bit with reading. And syntactic comprehension we talked about as well, with trying to decipher various types of complex sentences or sentence structures that place demands on verbal working memory. Evidence-based intervention for verbal working memory is scarce. And this article presents 5 guiding principles that frame the development of interventions for verbal working memory. It's informed by both theory and research. And what it does is it presents a multi-dimensional treatment model that looks at both external factors within a school day, as well as internal factors for students who struggle with verbal working memory. Here's an example of something that's within the article that I think really shows the impact of verbal working memory demands on literacy. This is a 6th grade student's response to the question, what are your concerns about English class? And she writes, not writing fast enough, that's why it's so hard to write what I want to write, because I think in my head the whole paragraph, but I forget what it was while I'm writing it, because new ideas keep popping up in my head that make me forget what I was going to say before. So there's a really good example of the working memory demands, as well as inhibitory control, right? New ideas popping up in your head. So let's go to the 5 principles, and I'll speak about each one in a little more detail. So the first principle talks about your capacity of your working memory and how it's a cognitive process that really can't be changed so much. And there's a lot of research that looks like computer training programs could help. But that is actually not true. Most of those computer training programs, they're all decontextualized, and they don't really show results on objectively measured real-world outcomes. Often the post-tests of those programs assess memory with the same task that students were trained on. And so it may show some short-term improvement in those particular skills on those particular tasks, but it certainly does not generalize to real life context within the classroom. So you can't really change the capacity of the working memory. So what can we do? So that brings us to principle 2, which is increasing your efficiency and automaticity with language, because doing that frees up resources in working memory, and that functionally improves your working memory. So especially for children with language impairments, listening and speak, all the language components, writing, reading, listening, speaking, those all place a load on working memory. So for example, for struggling readers, intervention goals that are focused on phonological and phonemic awareness, well, those help to improve decoding ability. And when your decoding is better, then that facilitates fluent reading. And so once those kind of fundamental processes are automatized, the mental effort and attentional resources that are required to recognize words are less. And so that allows the reader to devote more cognitive resources to comprehension monitoring, which is a verbal working memory demand. And then the other piece too, besides just decoding and reading fluently, is improving syntax comprehension, because certain types of sentences place greater demands on working memory. So think about passive sentences where the order of the words isn't necessarily the order of the action, or complex sentence structures where by the time you get to the end of it, you may not remember what was at the beginning. So that verbal working memory can really, that's a big demand on your verbal working memory. So direct intervention focusing on improving syntactic knowledge is very, very helpful in terms of increasing that automaticity with language. Also, increasing vocabulary, strengthening morphology. And the idea is that having stored knowledge about those aspects of language allows children to recognize those patterns, those linguistic patterns more readily, and thereby that alleviates the executive working memory demands for language processing. And so Singer and Bashir recommend that intervention for children with working memory limitations should aim to heighten that awareness of language, that meta-linguistic awareness, and firmly establish language knowledge in long-term memory so as to facilitate greater automaticity with language processing. Principle 3 talks about how you can support processing of verbal information in working memory through the use of visual anchors that serve to make language stand still. That's a great way of saying it. They talk about studies that have looked at visualization. And there's a study that showed they did 5 weeks of intervention on following complex directions. And one group worked on strategies of rehearsal, which is saying something over and over again, so saying the directions over and over again. Another group worked on visualizing, carrying out those directions, so visualization alone. And then a third group worked on rehearsal strategies and visualization simultaneously. And the fourth was a control group. And what they found is that the rehearsal strategies helped, but not in the long term. What really made a difference that generalized 8 months later is visual and verbal information together. So the rehearsal and visualization strategies being taught simultaneously. It allowed for more integrated information processing. And that actually really showed improvement even after 8 months after the intervention. So there is that relative permanence of visual information, and that helps to make language stand still if you have that visual. Another type of anchor, visual anchor, is advanced organizers, such as the one that I started with today with the outline. Advanced organizers are a type of graphic that depicts the hierarchical arrangement of key concepts and ideas visually prior to learning. So for example, I showed you the main topics, and then I showed you the subtopics, subordinate concepts underneath them, so that you had a clear idea of where this lecture was going beforehand. So that's a second type of visual anchor. And then the third type that they talk about in the article is graphic organizers. And not all graphic organizers are created equally, but graphic organizers are different from advanced organizers in that not all relationships that we're trying to get across are hierarchical. So graphic organizers are different ways of visually portraying the key concepts and the relationships between those concepts. And they may not always be hierarchical. So it's a way of showing the relationships in the language. And if you can visually depict how your thinking is organized or how reading passage is organized, that helps serve to make language stand still. And then one other thought about this principle number 3 is just that those visual anchors serve as sort of an external working memory space for students. They allow students to store information by moving it outside of their heads and into a visual spatial pattern that stays still on the paper. The fourth principle is about how verbal working memory demands of real-time language processing can be supported by heightening linguistic structure and salience. What that talks about, well, I want to just first go over a quote from this article that I think is just brilliant. And this is the quote: "Students cannot understand what they do not remember, and they cannot remember what they do not understand." That is so true. And what this principle is about is how the manner in which people speak and write has profound effects on comprehension and learning and verbal working memory. So think about a teacher that speaks really fast or uses really complex sentences or doesn't use pausing versus a teacher who speaks a little bit slower, rephrases or uses sentence structures that are easier to process, highlights keywords, makes gestures, uses pausing. Those things really do make a difference in terms of how much verbal working memory we need to use to process that information, particularly when it's purely oral, but definitely also when you need to write notes on it, and you need to remember it for a test, etc. So the final principle in this article is about professional collaboration. Typically, speech language pathologists, such as myself, would be involved in this because we know a lot about teacher talk, the language of, the classroom discourse, and we can also think about how the external factors in the classroom, the demands of verbal working memory, interact with the internal language factors of the student. And the professionals within the school district should be collaborating on how to improve those pieces for those students. So that's the Singer and Bashir article. And then I had a few other thoughts. This one is from Harvard University's Center for the Developing Child. And this is from the Building the Brain's Air Traffic Control System. So research indicates that the healthy development of executive function skills can be supported with specialized practice and training. And one of the things they talk about is research that has shown that preschools that use tools of the mind or some other type of executive function program have shown improvement on measures of academic performance. So think reading literacy skills, as well as social skills. So they talk about how the most effective early education programs are those that teach the curriculum, but in a way that optimizes scaffolding and practice of executive function skills. And some of the ways that adults can provide scaffolding for executive function skills are establishing routines, providing cues, and breaking big tasks into smaller chunks. And of course, the idea with scaffolds is that eventually they can be taken down and the child will be independent. That's always our goal. I read a really interesting article by Johanna Calderon, and it was relatively new information for me, but made so much sense about executive function skills. She talked about treatment for managing chronic stress and anxiety, which is often due to family, school, or health issues. And it's a big risk factor for executive function dysfunction, particularly in children. Think about when you're anxious about something. That stress freezes your ability, and definitely children's ability, to apply executive functions appropriately. When you're anxious about something, your inhibitions, your inhibitory control could go out the window. Your ability to have cognitive flexibility in that situation may be impaired, and certainly your working memory is impacted by that stress. So a new intervention that she talked about is mindfulness training, and it's showing promise. And the emerging data show that children who participate in mindfulness programs show less anxiety, greater concentration and memory skills, and they handle difficult emotions better. I thought that was really interesting and promising. So my final slide here, I just wanted to see if I could pull some things together and what are some common threads that I noticed about executive function. Well, the first one is definitely visualization and visual imagery. You heard me talk about Sarah Ward's information about nonverbal working memory and how important that mental imagery is for us to project ourselves into the future and make a mental movie of things. You also heard me talk about, from Singer and Bashir's article, how we want to bring in visualization as much as possible and have visual anchors that make language stand still. And then I was thinking, even the mindfulness, oftentimes when we're practicing mindfulness, we're making visual images in our minds. Another common thread that I notice is the importance of language, how automaticity in language and competence in language makes a big difference in terms of our executive function skills, about how the language, that spurt of growth in language skills, is at the same time as the dramatic growth in executive function skills, and that ages 3 through 5. And also in Sarah Ward's information, talking about the if-then and the self-talk. So language is a huge piece as well. And then the last thing that I was thinking about as a common thread is early intervention, because clearly with these periods of dramatic growth, we want to get in there at those early ages and do whatever we can to help support executive function skills in children. So that's what I had for today, but I did include my references and my contact information. And I wanted you to know that I'm happy to have presented today, but if anyone has any questions, concerns, or would like a copy of my PowerPoint slides, I'm happy to share them. And so my email address is there on that final slide. Thank you very much.